All right, let's jump right into it. We're looking at a huge international flashpoint that seemed to erupt out of nowhere. A sudden, really intense trade dispute between the US and India. Now, this is a story about how two countries who call themselves strategic partners ended up in a massive standoff, and it has major consequences for everyone. So let's break down exactly what went on.
Okay, so it all boils down to this one pretty staggering number, 50%. That is the total tariff that a whole bunch of Indian goods are now facing just to get into the US. And you gotta understand, this isn't just a little tax. It's basically a giant economic wall. Our sources say it's one of the steepest tariffs the US has ever hit a major trading partner with.
Which brings us to the big question, right? How on earth did this happen so fast? I mean, these are two countries that are constantly called strategic partners. How do you go from that to a full-blown trade war seemingly overnight? To really get it, we've got to peel back the layers on that 50% number and see what it's actually made of.
All right, so that 50%, it's not what you might think. It's not just one single tariff. It's actually two totally different penalties that got stacked right on top of each other. And honestly, that's where this whole story starts to get really interesting.
So how do you get to 50%? Well, think of it like a two-layer cake. The first layer, that's 25%, was a baseline tariff that was already sort of in the works. But then the administration came along and just slapped a second, totally new 25% oil penalty tariff right on top. Add them together, and bam, you've got this 50% shock to the system.
And the speed of all this was just breathtaking. Seriously, look at this timeline. In early August 2025, that first 25% tariff gets announced. Just a few days later, on August 6th, the White House drops the additional 25% penalty. And by August 27th, it's a done deal. The full 50% tariff is officially in effect. A huge shift in trade policy, all pushed through in less than a month.
So you've got to be asking, what in the world caused that sudden second tariff? The one that seemed to come out of left field? Well, it wasn't your typical squabble over goods. According to the sources we're looking at, the trigger was all about geopolitics and oil.
Yeah, the official reason given for that extra 25% was pretty blunt. It was a penalty, a direct penalty for India continuing to buy Russian oil. The U.S. administration essentially framed it as a direct consequence of India's energy policy, and they explicitly linked it to the ongoing war in Ukraine.
But here's the thing. Many analysts cited in our sources, they believe the oil was just the public trigger, the convenient excuse. They see this as a classic play of what they call strategic leverage. That's a fancy term for using a massive economic hammer, like a tariff, not just to punish someone, but to pressure a country into giving you what you want on much bigger issues, like other trade deals and even foreign policy.
You know, a 50% tariff isn't just some number on a spreadsheet. It creates very real shockwaves in the real world. And for India, the impact was absolutely immediate, and it was severe.
The pain from this was felt right across India's most important export businesses. We're talking about the absolute backbone of their industry. Things like textiles and clothing, jewelry, and electronics. I mean, these are companies that are built on selling to the American market. And they were suddenly left scrambling, trying to figure out how to absorb this massive new cost.
The situation got so dire that it went way beyond just losing some profit. Our sources are reporting that some manufacturers started looking at a really drastic option, just up and moving their factories to neighboring countries, literally leaving India just to get around the US tariffs. A move like that could have absolutely devastating long-term effects on India's economy.
An economic earthquake like this, well, it never stays just economic, does it? It was almost inevitable that it would spill over into diplomacy, and it sent the political relationship between the two countries into what you can only describe as a deep freeze.
India's reaction was, as you'd expect, swift and furious. Official statements came out condemning the tariffs with some very strong language. Unfair, unjustified, and unreasonable. And New Delhi also pointed out what it called a double standard, basically saying, hey, wait a second. Other American allies are buying Russian oil, and you're not hitting them with these kinds of penalties.
The tension here really started playing out in the media. First, these reports surfaced citing anonymous sources, claiming India was retaliating by putting major U.S. defense deals on hold. But then almost immediately, you get an official clarification from New Delhi flatly denying the whole thing. They called the reports false and fabricated. That kind of public back and forth, it's a really clear sign of just how tense and frayed the relationship had become.
And this whole thing wasn't just an international story. No, the tariffs lit a huge fire under a debate right here in the U.S. about the limits of presidential power and the entire future of American trade policy.
Over in Washington, the president's move to just unilaterally impose these kinds of tariffs, it set off all kinds of alarms on Capitol Hill. Our sources say you had lawmakers from both parties starting to question if this was a case of executive overreach. This whole dispute led directly to calls for new laws to limit the president's power on tariffs and give Congress more of a say. It sparked that classic American argument over the separation of powers.
So let's pull all these pieces together for a second. It all kicked off with a shocking 50% tariff hike. The official trigger, a penalty for India buying Russian oil. The impact? Economic chaos for Indian industries and a diplomatic relationship put on ice. And then, back home in the US, it ignites this fundamental debate about who's really in charge of trade. It's really a perfect storm of economics, politics, and diplomacy all crashing together.
And in the end, this whole episode really leaves us with a huge question for the world we live in today. When you take a tool of trade, like a tariff, and you start using it as a geopolitical weapon, who actually pays the final price? Is it the companies? Is it the consumers? Or is it the trust between nations that gets damaged, maybe for good? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this explainer.